May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each heart be holy and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Michael, you couldn't see it, but when you started the bagpipe sound on the organ, you had a lot of big smiles out here in the congregation. And I'm going to go ahead and offer this announcement here because it deserves a special kind of attention. This Sunday is our choir's last Sunday of leading us in worship as they're going to take a break for several weeks, a well-earned break, because they lead out in this ministry 50 services a year. They practice every Wednesday night and every Sunday morning before the service. And so they need a little break, right? So they're going to join us in the pews the next several weeks. But I think we just ought to offer the choir and Michael Mitchell a round of thankful applause for their ministry. Let me ask you a question. It's something I've been struggling with, just something for you to think about. It seems to be a question that many centuries have asked in one way or another. And the question is this: what makes a healthy church? What makes a healthy church? There have been many responses to this question. I won't attempt to summarize them, as I would inevitably fail to do their complexity and church history justice. But as you imagine, there have been many responses to this question of what makes a healthy church. The majority of the New Testament are letters written by Paul or someone writing on Paul's letterhead to encourage, to nurture, to exhort all kinds of churches in all kinds of places in all kinds of ways to be healthy. And it seems for Paul one of the defining characteristics of a healthy church, not the only one, but a defining essential characteristic of what makes a healthy church, is weakness. It seems for Paul a healthy church is a weak church. A weak church? We don't like that word, weakness. Who wants a weak church? Isn't that what's wrong these days? Don't we need strong churches, ones that really know how to make a mark, know how to bring them in, know how to get butts in the pews? Churches that everyone knows are strong and super spiritual and sustainable. A weak church, please. See, we don't like that word. Especially here in the United States, right? Part of our self-understanding, part of our DNA, our narrative is that we were this ragtag colony that overthrew the world's greatest empire and grew into the world's greatest superpower. This past week, we celebrated the 4th of July. Eric and I, driving back from the mountains of New Mexico, the highways were dotted with firecracker stands, small towns decked out in red, white, and blue, parades, marching bands, the Chamber of Commerce, barbecue. It was all there, all of it, in all these little towns. We came out of a Mexican food restaurant here in town the evening of the 4th, and I heard one guy say to his friend, "You think all them firecrackers are going to scare the dogs?" His friend replied, "No." But I don't believe him. I could tell in their voices, you could hear it. They were hoping to scare the dogs and the kids and all the neighbors. You could hear it. Big fireworks shows, music blaring, and the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in air. There's something in us that gravitates towards displays of power. And there's this impulse in the church to be the same photocopy of power. Of course, we don't want to hear about weakness. Of course we don't. That doesn't make us unique. I think there's been that impulse there all along. That's one of the reasons Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. You see, the church there has fallen under the influence of some preachers who refer to themselves, and get this, they refer to themselves something akin to the super apostles. Their teaching, evidently criticizing Paul and emphasizing three elements. First, they claimed a particular and exclusive heritage to the Christian faith. Second, they proclaimed a mastery over all of life's sufferings and adversity. And third, they boasted about their own transcendental spiritual experiences. Now, how appealing is that, huh? How appealing, how seductive, a teaching that essentially said you can be part of an exclusive club, you don't have to suffer anymore, and you can have all these wonderful, transcendental, spiritual experiences. Of course it was appealing. Of course people gravitated toward that. Of course, because essentially it is an expression of power. And these super apostles, these celebrity preachers, pointed their fingers at Paul. They pointed their fingers at Paul and said, look, can't you see? Look how he's just letting everybody in. Look how puny of a speaker and a presence he is. Look at that. Notice how he suffers. Look at how he suffers. There's no power there. And Paul replies, you're right. I am weak. You're right. Now, isn't that something? Isn't that something that Paul's not entering a battle of one-upmanship? He's not trying to prove or play worthiness games. He says, you're right. You're right. I am weak. But he goes on to say, but in the middle of my struggle, I heard a word from God who said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So, super apostles, if I'm going to boast in my weakness, that's where any power is at all. It's the power of Christ who dwells within me. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. And Paul embodies the words in his first letter he wrote to the Corinthians when he said, and God chose what is foolish in the world to confound the wise, and God chose what is weak in the world to confound the strong. When I was a kid growing up in the church, there was a member of our church named Dennis. My dad told me at one time Dennis was a college athlete at UCLA. I don't know what sport he played. Then, after receiving postgraduate degrees in theology and homiletics, which is a fancy word for preaching, Dennis was a rising star in the evangelical world, a sought-after preacher and conference speaker, until his early 30s when Dennis was diagnosed with MS. By the time Dennis was at our church, he was in his late 40s and in a wheelchair. But there were Sundays where Dennis would be wheeled to the front of our church, and he would recite poems he had composed in his head. Poems filled with faith and with doubt, with humor, with struggle, with wonder. He would recite these poems until MS took his ability to speak. And then his wife would wheel him to the front, and she would sit next to him and read poems that he had composed and she had transcribed through the years. I share this not as a commentary on a debilitating illness. I do not believe God gives people MS. I don't think God gives people cancer or any such thing, nor do I wish to romanticize any such struggle in people's lives. I share this because I am thankful for what Dennis modeled. And I share this because in Dennis, I see an icon of the church. I see an image of the church when we stop being so fixated on control and trends and stats and being big and being important and having position. when weakness becomes strength and poetry and praise pours from our lips. Shane Claiborne said, Christianity is at its best when it is peculiar, marginalized, and suffering, and it's at its worst when it is popular, credible, triumphal, and powerful. Maybe that's why Paul responded to his critics and the church he loved, yes, I struggle. Yes, I am weak. But God's grace is enough. Preacher and scholar Sally Brown writes, spiritual roots for churches may grow deepest and strongest as we struggle together through experiences we would not choose. Did you hear it? We struggle together through experiences we would not choose. A dwindling budget, the death of beloved members, a change in leadership. Then we have to risk trusting and loving at new levels, practice compassion, and spirit-filled creativity. So St. Andrews, what if the church is most transformational, not when we possess strength, but when we embrace our weakness? What if the church is most Christ-like when we stop pursuing the image of we got it all together and instead hold space for people to come undone? What if the very real challenges we face here and churches face everywhere are actually the very gifts? They're actually gifts by which we get to experience the grace of God. These are just some more questions I'm struggling with, and invite you to struggle with them as well. Struggle can be good, you know. It can remind us that we're not as strong as we think we are, and we don't have to be. Maybe over time we'll even learn to boast in it. Who would have ever thought that? Who would have ever thought we could boast in our weakness? Amen.